Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Hi there, you're watching Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson. Today we're joined by Mona Nguyen Lee of Puzzle HR. Mona is going to be speaking to us today about returning to the workplace in a post-COVID pandemic mindset or during our COVID pandemic mindset, what employers can require and what employees have rights and need to know. Mona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you again, Morgan. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mona. Thank you. Always a pleasure to see you. Greatly appreciate you joining us today on the show.
Absolutely.
So, thank you. Yeah. So, Mona, please tell me a little bit about yourself and Puzzle HR.
Sure. So I'm the regional sales manager for Puzzle HR, which is a national HR outsourcing provider. And what we do is we come in and we help fill in the gaps of a company's HR department. So if they don't have one, we can be their entire HR department, following the entire employee life cycle. Or if the company has an HR department, we fill in where they may not be successfully tackling some of their HR challenges. We can also help support an existing company that has a bigger HR department by doing project-based work. So what makes us different than other HR providers is that we're not a bunch of HR professionals. We're actually business owners and business-minded individuals who know HR, who came and started an HR support service.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. How long has Puzzle HR been around?
Gosh, we opened our doors right before the pandemic hit. So there were 11 of us who left our jobs at a bigger company and came to start Puzzle HR back in October of 2019. And since then, we have grown to about a little under 70 employees in that 16-month period.
Wow, that's fantastic. Mona, thank you so much for joining us. I'm amazed that you even have the free time right now as all these things are going on and all these questions are being asked about what employers can require in getting back to the workplace. So again, thank you so much. Which kind of leads me to my first question for you, or I guess second now question for you. What are some of the things employers should be mindful of when asking employees to return to an in-person work environment?
Great question, loaded question, by the way, because in these times, the bigger question should be, do you need to return to work in person, or can the work be done remotely? And I think what the pandemic certainly has done with a positive impact to all of society is moving all of us forward remotely. So to answer your question, though, you have to consider, is the work to be done, can it be done remotely, or does it have to be done in person? Now, for example, if you're in customer service and it's an in-person position, then workers need to be given the proper PPEs, the proper protective equipment, and there should be a process of notifying employees that it's time to come back to work, but employee safety truly should be number one. After you answer the question, do you need to come back in person?
That's interesting. Yeah, I do know that that's one of the major things that we have seen in this COVID-19 landscape is all of those meetings that could have been emails and all of those jobs that can now be remote. Do you think that, regardless of if a job can be done remotely or not, that an employer might have the ability to say, we need you back in person because that's their preference, or what do the employers have as the ability to make that decision?
If you're the business owner, you have a lot of rights because it's your name that's hung on the shingle above the business. But the business owner also has to take a look at, like I said, the safety of the employees returning to work, and then measuring has the work been done successfully remotely? For example, at Puzzle HR, we launched our company and everybody was remote. So when the pandemic hit, we didn't know any different because that's how we've always done work. And we've actually grown. So if a business owner is looking to require someone to come back to work, we need to evaluate, can that work be done effectively, successfully, and safely in person? And meetings that, like this one, these types of interviews that we're having, it used to be we'd have to be in person, right? But technology is allowing us to do this, you from your home office, me from my home office. So as a business owner is looking to bring people back, truly consider, is it safe? Is it the right time? Can the work be done? And if you need to bring people back because there are certain things like collaborating in brainstorming for a project or in-person training, then maybe you can have a hybrid of some days where people are in person and that's when you have in-person meetings, or some days where it's remote and folks are doing work from their home offices. Um, as more and more employees are able to get shots, some of their work, like outside salespeople, have to meet prospects at prospect site or at an outside Starbucks. So they're trying to find ways to still do the job effectively, if you will, even if it is in person. And some jobs, like for example, restaurants, right? Besides the curbside pickup, some people like the experience of outdoor dining. So then you need to have the folks that are serving in a restaurant be in person because that can't be done remotely, as we all know.
Yeah, and you mentioned something I think is rather interesting. As folks are eligible to get vaccines, is that something an employer can require of employees, that they must have vaccines or proof of vaccination before returning to the workplace in person?
Wow. So that question is popping up left and right. And right before I got onto this with you, I actually had an email from a prospect who is considering our services. And she asked the question, can we require one of our employees who just returned from a vacation in Mexico to get tested? And the answer is yes, you can require an employee to get tested because that company has employees working in person. It's a distribution center. So employees come, they pack and ship things out. So when this employee came back to work, the employer can show good faith and say, please get tested and we'll pay for it because it's for the good of the entire company. And when it comes to vaccine, if it is necessary and your job requires that you have to be in person to do it, the employer can ask the employee to be vaccinated and bring, the little card that we all get. But the bigger question really is, if the employee doesn't want to get vaccinated, there are two ways that they can say no. And it is based on religion and it is based on, I just had this. It's definitely, medical and religious reasons. And then the employer has to make reasonable accommodation that if they can't get tested because there's some sort of religious restrictions to what they're doing, or if medically they're allergic to something within the vaccine, then the employer can't push that employee to do it. And, Morgan, we've seen a lot of lawsuits in 2020. I mean, we're talking like 1,500 lawsuits about discrimination based on these vaccines and the tests requiring employees to come back. And some employees even feel like they were wrongfully terminated because they wouldn't get tested or they don't want to get the shot. So we really don't know what the law is going to say because it's still being discussed as we speak today.
Right. So even with ongoing litigation and how that is all shaking out, it's my understanding that at least in Virginia, the at will employment says that employers can terminate for a number of reasons. Could you remind us, other than religious and medical, if there are any other exceptions to that that might go into, considerations that employers should be mindful of for if they do choose to terminate an employee, what some of those big red flags are of areas that they can't say, here's the reason, if they provide a reason at all.
Right. Thank you. So the at will simply means that the employment can be terminated by the employee or by the employer for no reason at all. You don't even have to give a reason when terminating employment. Now, what you have to be careful, of course, is the Title VII, the protected classes within the workforce. Pregnancy is one of them. Obviously, religion, sexual identity is another one, as well as women and age discrimination. These are some of the big ones. Like, for example, I was reading an article about a 70-year-old who didn't want to come to work because he hadn't gotten the vaccine and he did not feel comfortable interacting with other people, even though the employer provided masks and great ventilation and everybody was 6 feet apart. He was terminated because his job required him to be on site and he wasn't able to be on site. So he's bringing a lawsuit based on the fact that he's a 70-year-old person, which people over 40 is a protected class. So you've got to have reasonable accommodations for your employees or make the effort of reasonable accommodations. And let's not forget, employees can ask employers for those reasonable accommodation, but if it impinges upon the company financially or they just can't do it, then it's not against the law.
Interesting. So, for example, when mentioning, PPE, needing masks, sanitizing of locations, and everything else, if an employee asks for those things and the employer is unable to deliver on them, does the employer have an obligation to provide any type of face covering or increased cleaning and sanitation measures, or even, for those in-person meetings that you mentioned, social distancing around a conference table? Are those requirements of an employer that they have to provide?
So if the employer is in the state of Virginia, then yes, because these are the CDC recommendations for returning to work safely, all the things you mentioned in the PPEs. It is also governed by OSHA requirements, depending on the industry, right? So if you're working in a factory where there's fumes, you were already wearing masks prior to the pandemic. But if you're working in an office where people are coming in and out, and you're an office in Virginia, and Virginia says in order to open up, you do have to provide the protective equipment, the mask, the hand sanitizers, the 6 feet distance. So yes, it is required of the employer. And it's not that expensive, right, to buy a box of masks from a warehouse or to go and order it on Amazon, because you're protecting your customers and you're protecting your employees.
Now, when you say employees have the right to ask, do you recommend that those types of requests be in a form of written communication, or how does an employee ask those and make sure they're documenting them correctly?
Great question. Yes, absolutely. Put it in writing. If there's an HR department, give it to the HR person. If there isn't, because it's a small company, then approach the office manager or directly the business owner that they supply those things. And there's been a lot of whistleblowers where employees are showing up for work and the equipment isn't there. Like they run out of masks, for example, or hand sanitizers, and they don't feel safe. Ask someone, tell someone, put it in writing so that if anything ever happens down the road, you as an employee have asked for them to accommodate with the PPEs.
As an employee, it sounds like that's one of the bigger rights that employees have, is the ability to ask for things that are reasonable accommodations. Are there any other major areas where employees have that ability to ask um, beyond reasonable accommodations? What are some of the other major areas that employees have the rights to speak to? Some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head is, if allowed to or required to work remotely and required to be connected to the internet, that's a utility that, perhaps there's increased use on bandwidth. Can an employee reasonably ask for an employer to help subsidize, connectivity? Or what are some of the other asks that employees can make of employers?
So if it's required for you to successfully do the work that you're hired to do, the employer should accommodate, right? For you and I, we all have our Surface Pros so that we can get online and do the work. For other employees, like you said, getting the internet access is a reasonable accommodation, because if you're to attend these online meetings and you live in a house that doesn't have internet, how else are you going to jump online unless you have the bandwidth to do that? And I believe there was a point where the PPP, part of the caveat of that was to have employers make some reasonable expense reimbursement to the employees who are now shifting from working on site to working remotely, not just in forms of having a tablet and an internet, but things like a walking desk or a place to sit. And we've seen the stress of the COVID pandemic where folks are working from home remotely. They're sitting in their closet because they've got a 5-year-old sitting at the kitchen table trying to do his homework. So there are certain things that an employee can ask for. Now, if you wanted a $500 fancy chair that leans back and massages you while you're working, is that reasonable? Probably not, but you can ask for a chair where you can sit up, especially if you have physical needs, like an ergonomically correct chair. If you would have had that in the office, maybe you can ask them to let you bring that home. That's reasonable, right? But anything extravagant where it can financially impact a company and the company goes belly up, no one is going to benefit from that.
So it sounds like it's a, better be safe than sorry. Ask for it. The worst that can happen is no, but in reality, the worst that could possibly happen is possible termination, if depending on how much you're willing to push the issue. Do you ever have recommendations for employees who, picking their battles, or how important this is to them? How far to push if the initial answer is no?
So it depends who's giving you the answer. If it is a supervisor and the supervisor has the decision, has the ability to make that decision, but you're not happy with the decision, then you could appeal, because every company has to have a process where employees can get their voice heard. Because sometimes the office manager that you request this of may not have the ability to spend $250, so they say no to you. But you know that you need the equipment in order to do the work, you can go the next step up. So it's due process. Just because you get a no the first time doesn't necessarily mean that it's a no. It might be a no because that person can't give you a yes.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
so take it all the way up to the business owner. And, if you're working in a large company, thousands of employees, there definitely is a process in their HR department. You go first to your supervisor, and then if the supervisor isn't responding, you go to the supervisor's supervisor, the department head. And if there's an HR department, you obviously go there as well, because you don't go straight to a CEO of a 1,000-man company.
That's a great, use for having an HR department for companies who haven't considered one before. Maybe you don't want to be the person who's saying yes or no, and you'd rather have, somewhat of a different arbiter there. Having somebody who's in HR who can help think, through the ramifications and the legality of things, I think that's important for companies that don't at the moment. My next question, Mona, is: can employers require face coverings to be worn at a work site, if in person, with or without a government mandate? What rights do employers have? We did cover that employers can be asked or can potentially provide face coverings, but what rights do they have to mandate or require those face coverings to be worn?
In the absence of a federal or state mandate, the employer has to first take care to ensure that the workplace is safe for their employees and for their clients. So if you're working in, let's say, an office where you manufacture signs for buildings, um, and you're the front office person and the client comes in and places the order, the business owner can require that the employees are wearing the face covering because they're interacting with the public. And if they catch something from the client and pass it back on to everybody else in the back who's manufacturing that customer place order, then what good is that going to do for everyone? You've got to look at the big picture. It isn't just about what the law says, it's using common sense, is the other thing. When at a loss, use some common sense.
That makes plenty of sense to me, for sure. So when dealing with these things, how would an employer communicate that to employees? Would it be best via memo, or how does that get communicated? Or is that a situation where an entire employee handbook should consider to be updated? Or more importantly, not just how is that communicated, what updates should people be making to employee handbooks at this point, or consider making?
Right. So an employee handbook is a living document. Just because you finished it 2 months ago doesn't mean that it's still update, because federal and state laws will be dictated upon an employer based on the number of employees that they have, their threshold for compliance. So just because you finish updating your revisions, it's now what, April 13th? And if your handbook was done in December of last year, you think, yeah, I'm fine. But you take a look at the company as a whole. Did you add additional employees? Were those employees in a different state than the employees of the handbook that was done back in January? So it's not so much a time frame of how often you should update your handbook. I don't want to say every 3 months or every 30 days, because that's ridiculous. But it's really dependent on your company's growth, how laws have changed externally, and your handbook should always be updated as you go along. The pandemic certainly has had employers rewriting their remote policy on working, about protective equipment, about safety in returning to work. Uh, but it's truly the number of employees that you have on your payroll that dictates what federal and state laws apply to you. But in terms of communicating company policies, as you have new policies that come up, you can put it in writing as a memo, share it with everyone within the organization, make sure that they've signed off that they received the update. And when you can update it in your employee handbook as a whole, you do it at that time. But always a notice to the employees. The good rule of thumb is, when something is going to be required, put it in writing, hold a meeting, make sure everybody understands, and give them an opportunity to ask questions.
Fantastic. So is that something that Puzzle HR works on frequently? Would Puzzle HR remind employers that, hey, once a quarter we should be updating? Here are the memos you sent. Do we want to incorporate those? How would you all approach that conversation with employers?
Great question. So what's great about working with a company like Puzzle HR is that we're going to be proactively looking out for the client's best interest, because that's what they pay us to do. And we don't wait to hear from the client to ask questions. Instead, we assess the HR processes that they have in place and what are some of those gaps? And we address those gaps. Those are projects that are in flight. And we might have 3 to 5 projects at any given time. But if there's something that's emerging within the organization or happening outside on a federal or state level, we're keeping our clients abreast of what's happening because, again, our job is to protect the employer. So we're already taking a look at what's changing on a federal and state level, and we're proactively bringing that to the client to let them know. Right now, the big thing these days, besides returning to work safely, is the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some folks think that just because you have different folks working in a company that you're meeting those needs. And that's not what it really means, right? It's about giving everyone a fair shake, being open and understanding and leaning into what it is that your employees want from you. And how do you, once again, bring everyone together? Because the more diverse a force is, the more productive you might be, and some great innovations might come out of that.
You mentioned that equity portion, and it leads me back to my question about data access and the notion of the digital divide. If people didn't previously have internet at home because they had it at work and they don't have a mobile phone with a data plan, for example, is that something that beyond a reasonable request could be put in a handbook saying, if you need, access to technology, here's a threshold, we'll compensate $20 a month, whatever it is. Is that something that should go in a handbook, or is that something that to kind of memorialize that equity? Or is that something that, should be a one-off so that not everyone's applying for it? You have a company of 1,000 people and they all say, oh, you'll give me up to $20 for data access. I want that $20 versus, those who need it more or otherwise.
So I think the question is two-part. Number one, I'll address, and that is when you're hiring for a position, there are job descriptions and requirements to work and do the job and get it done correctly, whether it's a skill set or equipment. So an employer has the responsibility of making sure that the employees have the tools that they need in order to do their job. So let's take, for example, the internet access. If you lived without internet before and you were an employee in a restaurant and you didn't need the equipment because everything was there and it was done on site. But now you're working remotely. You may go in a couple of times a week, but the majority of your time, because you're the office manager or part of the supply chain, you have to work from home. Then you can ask the employer for reimbursement. But what's happening, and we're seeing it more and more, is that employers are already responding to that, and employers are rewriting some of the way that they can compensate employees by building in an expense allowance for those who might need internet access from home.
Thank you, Mona. I'm gonna have to stop you right there. We're going into a break, but I do want to pick this up in just a moment. Again, I'm Morgan Jameson. This is the Inside Scoop. We're joined with Mona Nguyen Lee of Puzzle HR, talking about returning to the workplace in the COVID pandemic era.
The COVID-19 vaccines can be our chance to get back to our plans, who we are, what we miss, to get back to each other, to life. But it's okay to have questions, like, how were the vaccines tested? In rigorous clinical trials among adults of diverse backgrounds. Can the vaccines give you COVID-19? You cannot get COVID-19 from a vaccine. Why should I get vaccinated? Protecting yourself also helps protect the people around you. Find the latest information at getvaccineanswers.org.
Before we celebrate the freedom most Americans have, we must fight for the freedom all Americans deserve. Because all lives can't matter until Black lives matter.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Hi there, and welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Morgan Jameson. Today, we're joined by Mona Nguyen Lee of Puzzle HR. We're continuing our conversation about employees returning to the workplace, what their rights are, what employers need to know, and what they can require of employees. Mona, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Morgan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. During the break, we had a really candid conversation about some of the potential efficiencies that employees and employers can be putting in as policy matters, including staggered workplace hours. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and if there's any unique ways that people can consider returning to work safely?
Absolutely. So if after all, the employer determines that it's important for the employee to return physically to the office, and they've made reasonable accommodation to ensure that there's sufficient space for everyone to function and be productive in their job, one of the ways to do that, if you don't have enough space for everyone to be distanced by 6 feet, is to do a staggered return to work. And what I've seen that was pretty creative that came up is a friend of mine returned back to a cube farm, and they would stagger 50% in one day, excuse me, not 50%, a third one day, another third another day. And when you're in the office, there's a flag that she puts up above her cubicle. So at night, the cleaning service can pay extra attention to where she sat by wiping down the computer screens, the phone, the armchair. Because people can't all show up all at once and return to 100% in person. It probably isn't a good idea, number one, because of the limited space. But we also mentioned, Morgan, that an employer can do an airflow study to see if their office is sufficiently moving the air around and out so that you can keep it fresh and not stagnant, like they do in an airplane. How do they do that? Can we get that done in an office so that employees feel a little safer? Because we all know that engaged employees who know that they're working in a great place, that they are happy with the way they're being treated and protected, will be productive employees.
Absolutely. It sounds like an inch goes the mile there as far as the investment and how folks are moving things forward. In addition to airflow studies, are there other considerations for that safe work environment, such as you talk about flow studies? I'm sure we all remember the arrows on the floor that most people didn't pay attention to until it was too late in the various stores or other locations. Mona, what are some of those things that employers can think about or employees can bring to the table as a suggestion? What are some of those creative things as well?
Right. So when we're returning back to the office and we're having a cup of coffee every 2 hours, you're going to need to go potty, right? So can you make that women's room or the men's room a little bit safer for your employees by marking the stalls that can be used versus everyone next to each other, and maybe even finding a way to access additional restrooms in an office, because that, besides the kitchen, that's the other place that gets a lot of traction. I know we can't time and say you only have 5 minutes or it's your turn to go to the potty, but just communicating with the employees, and it sounds so elementary, but letting them know, here's our space, it hasn't changed, it didn't get any bigger, it didn't get any smaller. So what can we all do as professionals and adults to make everybody else feel safe? Maybe, I don't know, that I'm thinking that maybe we ask for another floor to go use their restroom, if that's a possibility, just so that we don't all feel cramped in one place. And of course, the kitchen area If there was only one desk for folks to gather, then maybe put a picnic table outside. The weather's getting nicer so that employees can take their bag lunch and go eat outside in the open, fresh air. Is that what you mean, Morgan?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I think it's important to definitely think about those things, utilization of space, and how you can figure it out from there. Um, you know, right before the break, we were talking about what different ways employers can help with equity in a balanced work environment. May it be on that staggered shifting, like you're talking about, or otherwise. And I know we cut you off partway way through that. What are some of the benefits that you can see of providing employees with? We keep going back to data. I think that that's a big one that we keep talking about, is everyone's so plugged in. The internet is no longer a commodity; it's a necessity. It's not a luxury. What are some of those benefits, as we consider providing that accessibility to the workforce?
Right. So if the job requires that you have internet access in order to function, then the employer can make that available. And it wouldn't be something you put in a handbook. It's really more of the essential functions of a job in order for it to be effectively executed. So it might be in the job description that says, you have to be able to access data in order to crunch the numbers, in order to make the recommendation. And if you are one of those analysts that works from home, then you have to have the internet. And that is something the HR department would be able to say that that's an essential tool that the employee needs to have in order to do their job. So if that means getting higher internet access, then the employer has to do it. Because at the end of the day, it is a necessity. And if they can't get that and they can't do their work, then how's that good for anyone? Plus, these expenses, of course, as you know, are business expenses that can be written off by the employer.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered that before. Providing that equity and that accessibility, rather, to the workforce. There are business benefits there for doing what seems to be the right thing. So we're always incentivizing good morals. And also saying, if somebody's required to do a task, but we're not providing them with the tools and resources to do that task, can we hold them to that? Earlier, you mentioned your friend who works in a cube farm. For those who are new to the show, or for those who are not familiar with that phrase, or those who've always only known remote work environment, can you define what a cube farm is, and the traditional types of roles or duties that are done there versus a corner office with an amazing view?
Sure, absolutely. So a cube farm is a workplace where it's open air. I'm sorry, not open to the natural environment, but big space in an office where people are partitioned off by using office furniture walls to separate, so that maybe you've got salespeople coming in and you've got a sales team of 20 people who come in and out in order to submit deals, or they need to come in and pick up marketing equipment or what have you. So that means that you've got to have a lot of space for a lot of people to come in and out of, and there's no privacy. It's out in the open. And I just lost my train of thought there. Morgan, cue me again.
The cube farm, you mentioned it when your friend was putting up the flag, and just defining what that is. And, you mentioned restrooms earlier, and the stalls next to each other. Just kind of defining what a cube farm is, and the difference between that and the corner office utilization.
Sure. So the cube farm is where there's a lot of folks who come in and do the same types of jobs. And instead of having an individual office, because they're not necessarily going to be in the office all day, they come in, they dock their laptops to do whatever it is that they need to do, and then they leave. So it's more economical for a company to have 20 different desks that are partitioned off by just walls that only go up in one way, and it's not private. And that's why they call it a cube farm, because you're sitting in cubicles doing your work. Whereas a CPA might have their corner office in a building and they've got a door that they can shut for privacy. So my one friend who works in this cube farm says she goes in on her in days, and when she's doing the work, she puts up that red flag on top of the cube wall so that at night the cleaning team can come in and give it an extra scrub just for safety's sakes.
Yeah, so I would imagine you're not using, two cubes next to each other. You're
No,
staggering them out and figuring it out.
exactly. So when you're rotating the work schedule, you're making sure that if you have 20 cube desks, that there's an empty space in between each so that your employees can have some space to do their work and not feel like you're sitting on top of each other or breathing on top of each other, for that matter.
Absolutely. So you mentioned staggered, and I've used the phrase a few times, staggered work schedule. Do you mind defining that in some of the best practices when establishing a staggered work schedule?
Sure. So HR should always have a seat at the table when it comes to strategizing the workforce. And as you're considering coming back into an in-person, there are essential duties and functions of every job. And once you determine which folks are the ones you need back in an office in order to be more productive or to meet the client demand, then you can determine on what days certain individuals should come in, because you want to keep in mind collaborative days that when you do have meetings, you want certain people in there. So just like schools, where schools are doing asynchronous days that you're working in the classroom and days that you're not, you can take that and apply it to the workplace. Have a certain group of folks come in on certain days and other folks on other days, depending on the functions, again, of the job and what needs to be done.
Okay. And I guess, that would also be helpful with things such as contact tracing, which I know so many of us have learned about recently.
Yes.
Knowing who's in when and limiting any potential spread of anything to a smaller pool versus the greater pool as a whole.
Right. I mean, think about it. When I went and got my hair done, right, 2 weeks ago, my stylist would have 4 chairs. And typically on a good day, all 4 chairs are taken. But because of COVID, he only took half of that. So there'd be 2 people. I sat on one end, someone else sat on the other end. And that's just the way the new norm is going to look like until it is safe for all of us to go back in person. But let's be real here. We have seen that people are still productive, profit is still being realized, business still gets done. And at what cost is that to the employees, their mental health? So it's not like you need to bring everybody back. Take a look at the workforce and see who really needs to come back before making that decision to invite everyone back in person.
Mona, is there any anecdotal information in your world that you've picked up, talking to people about HR, what some of the other business benefits have been to employers or employees during this shift to remote work, other than realizing that a lot of this work can be done remotely? Is there something that you think our viewers might not necessarily know or be aware of? May it be savings or anything else?
Nice cue, Morgan. So like we were talking in our break, you'd ask us, what's the number one savings for business owners during this pandemic? Besides the fact that you don't need as much space, so you can renegotiate your rent as an owner. The space just isn't needed. Maybe you don't need 10,000 square foot anymore. It's only just 5. There's a savings there. But there's also the impact of, like you said, the toilet paper, right? At the beginning, where everybody's working from home, they don't need to make those big industrial toilet paper rolls anymore that goes into the office because everybody else is needing them at home. But also, not to be funny, but think about the employee not having to commute, what effect that has on our environment, and what effects that has on the employee's ability to spend a little bit more time at home. Although now, after 18 months of it, we want the commute time so that we can, decompress and get our mood ready for the day. But you are definitely saving on eating out lunches. The employers are also realizing that employees need recognition, and you have to be creative how you keep them engaged by what we see some of our companies doing is turning to delivery services to have meals delivered to the employee's home to let them know that they're not really working all alone, that there are people doing the same thing. Making sure that you engage your employees by having more frequent one-on-ones, whether it's just a conversation. Hey, I know your son wasn't feeling well the other day. Just want to make sure you're okay. That human contact, don't forget to do that with your staff, because more than ever, because we can't see each other and touch each other, we need to know that our company cares about us. And of course, the more an employee feels cared for, the more productive they are. So an employee needs to just keep in mind that they're people just like you and me. We need the positive reinforcement. We need to be told that things are going well, and we need honest feedback, human contact, and that can still be done remotely.
There's a phrase that I learned a few years ago: connectivity drives community. And I think you're right that when people are connected, transferring some of those water cooler or pass by, knock on the door, or knock on the cube farm conversations, that when you're connecting with people, it really just drives that community. Anecdotally, one of the things my employer we instituted was Netflix Club, similar to a book club. We assumed everyone had Netflix as one of the most common things. I swear they're not sponsoring me to say their name, but we pick a show every month and we watch that show. And at the end of the month, we discuss it together. Some people finish the season, some people go on to another season, but it's our way to, have that. Here's a common element that we're talking about that's not directly work related, and it's not required. It's totally voluntary. But I'll be the first to say, nobody has opted out of Netflix Club at this point. It seems to be an interesting thing that people can do, and plus the added benefit of taking 1 hour out of the work month to have that Zoom meeting or that digital meeting to talk about it.
Right.
People don't mind that 1 hour of time, because that's the same amount of time from that knock on the door conversation and that water cooler conversation.
You're right about that, for sure.
Mona, I'm curious. I read in the news recently, or I heard recently, it may have even been from you during one of our previous conversations, that there are potentials for incentivizing people to get vaccinations. What is happening there? Can you shed any light on that?
Oh man, Morgan, you're gonna go there? Okay. So the vaccine, while it's doing good, there are some people who still don't want to get the shot. And some employers feel that if they require their employees to all be vaccinated, then everyone can come back to work a lot sooner in person. And we've seen some companies out there saying, hey, go get your vaccine, show us the proof, we'll give you $100 cash or a bonus or a $50 gift card to Amazon. And while the intent there is good, let's not forget that it could open up an entire Pandora's box, right? The requirement of the employer to ask an employee to put medicine in their arm without really fully understanding the impact. And now I know we're going to get controversial and you'll probably get some calls, but let's go there. If an employee gets a shot and they have an adverse reaction to it, and that employee, let's say, dies, then what burden is that on the employer for that? Is it a wrongful death lawsuit now? So it's too early for decisions such as that to be made to say, get the shot before you return to work. You can ask it, you could recommend it, but can you mandate it? Well, again, it depends. The essential functions of the job. Is it necessary? for them to do that. So be careful. I mean, right, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I know we all want everybody to be safe. And employers do too. Maybe in their zeal to make it happen a lot sooner, it might create some unintended consequences, if you will.
So an employer can require vaccination, proof of vaccination for returning to the workplace environment. The consideration of how necessary is returning to the workplace environment should go into effect, and the when to return to the workplace environment should go into effect as well. I know, for example, on many places are opening up their availability to receive vaccinations on April 16th, or they just did. What's a reasonable time frame? Can an employer say you must be vaccinated by a certain date?
I don't know that's a fair request of an employer, because it comes down to the distribution of the vaccine, the ability for the employee to get the appointment, and also with one of the vaccine being reevaluated, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that means that's one third less availability out there. So you can't say within 2 weeks you need to have your vaccine or you can't come to work. Because if you're showing that you can be productive remotely, then what's the point of coming back in person? So to answer your question, you've got to be reasonable when making that request to say 2 weeks, everybody get their vaccine. Well, it may cause undue, how shall I say, hardship on the employee who might not have a car to drive to the CVS to get that shot. So again, being reasonable, understanding that all this is new. And for the most part, we've seen employers being extremely accommodating to the employees. Everybody just wants to get back to normal, whatever that new normal looks like. And along the way, there are things that we have to be comfortable doing.
Now, I would imagine that messaging inconsistency is key. Saying people we're going back to work May 1st. Everyone's coming back to the office, and we're going to stagger or we're not, or however they want to do it. It wouldn't make sense to me, and I have heard this, that some employers are saying if you've been vaccinated, you don't have to wear a face covering, incentivizing said vaccination, versus if you're not, if you haven't been, you do, which goes against kind of the CDC guidelines of you should be face covered around those who aren't vaccinated. But I mean, that brings up, some kind of notion of a vaccine passport or proof of vaccination in the workplace. What goes, into that? What's your advice there on the, some, all, none? Is it just follow CDC guidance? What's your advice?
I would have to go with follow what the CDC says, because they know a lot more about this than we do. And I would say that just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean that you can't be a carrier of the coronavirus. So you could pass that on to someone else. So should everybody wear a mask? Should people not be able to wear a mask because they're vaccinated? Again, going back to common sense, common courtesy, human kindness, let's try to be just try to be consistent in the practice of safeguarding everyone's health. And for me personally, I will continue to wear the mask even though I'm vaccinated, because I don't know who I might be exposing to or is exposing me who isn't wearing a mask. So I would definitely defer to, your state mandates. So Virginia.gov has a list of things that they say you should do and consider when returning to work. The CDC has it, and so does OSHA, because OSHA cares about your safety when you're at work. So I would say, for sure, you don't want, and here's the other thing too, Morgan, it's about if you give some people the right not to wear a mask and others to wear masks, Could that possibly point you in the direction of discrimination because someone can't get the vaccine for religious reasons and now they have to wear a mask? It's just a lot to consider.
Having a strong HR department is important, as we are learning here today. I know that we just have a few minutes left. Mona, you have been a fabulous guest. I don't want to wrap up without giving you some opportunity here. You mentioned some of the resources that people can go to, CDC, Virginia, some of those other OSHA places to look. Do you all at Puzzle HR have any of these recommendations or any places for employers or employees to look and see some best practices?
Absolutely. You could also go to the puzzlehr.com website, because at the beginning of the pandemic, we did quite a bit of webinars as well as take questions from employers. And we've got recordings on there about returning to work safely, about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, about having an employee handbook, about employee engagement. There's a ton of recorded webinars on our website. Again, it's www.puzzlehr.com is one place that you can go and see what we've already done. The other place would be, of course, the virginia.gov or maryland.gov, whatever state in which you operate as an employer, and the CDC and OSHA.gov as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me plug Puzzle HR, Morgan.
Sure, absolutely. No, I'm very grateful that you are with Puzzle and that you are with us today to explain this information. Mona, with the last 2 minutes that we've got left here, what do you think is the number one thing employers and employees should be mindful of when considering returning to an in-person work environment?
Great question. And it all goes back to safety. Is it safe to do so? Is it necessary? Because for 14 months, we've all been working remotely, and you've seen the profitability. You've seen the employee engagement. You've seen how things go on. And there have been some great innovations that's come out of this pandemic. So while we're all missing our friends at the office, we're missing those lunches and happy hour, the first thing to consider, is it necessary to go back? You can tell, right? I'm pro remote workforce, but is it really necessary to go back into the office 5 days a week? If it is important that they return, then make some reasonable accommodations where they can work from home a few of those days instead of all 5.
Great.
So safety is the number one priority.
Safety first, absolutely. Mona, thank you very much for this safety first interview that we did in returning back to the workplace. Again, I'm Morgan Jameson, your host of Inside Scoop. We were joined by Mona Nguyen Lee of Puzzle HR. Thank you so much for joining us